That night, Shilian once again changed into women's clothing. Although he was no stranger to cross-dressing by now, it was his first time pretending to be a pregnant woman. It took him no more than half an instant's time to get his makeup on, and once his face was painted, he stuffed a pillow up his skirts to give himself a belly, with the lock of hair from the expected concubine hidden in said pillow. He was calm as he lay on the bed, and slowed his breathing. It didn't take long before he fell deeply asleep. An unknown amount of time passed. Shilian slowly opened his eyes. The sight before him was no longer the bedchamber of the wealthy merchant's concubine. It was a resplendent pavilion. Shilian's first reaction was to feel for whether Fengshin was still next to him, and when he felt it was so, he relaxed. Fengshin was a sacred sword, after all, so it was bound tightly to his person. After that, he slowly sat up, but he found the bottom of his palms to be strangely sticky. When he raised his hands to look, he discovered he was lying on a bed covered in a terrifyingly large pool of blood. It had not yet dried, and it had painted him in an alarming shade of red. Shilian was used to strange sights, so he calmly got out of bed. He took a couple steps, and suddenly felt something drop from him. Looking down, it was the pillow, and he hastily picked it back up and stuffed it back under his skirts. As he took another few steps, his belly dropped again, so he had to keep holding onto it with both hands as he surveyed the surroundings. Having grown up in a royal palace, he had been unconsciously influenced by the things he saw and heard there, so when it came to beauty, Shilian had his own metric of judgment. While this little establishment looked quite exquisite, it was filled with a certain feminine fragrance. If he had to guess, it was a restaurant or a place of pleasure. Regarding the architecture, the style was really quite old, very much like a building from centuries ago, although he couldn't pinpoint when. With such evidence on hand, this was unlikely to be a haunting born from the wealthy merchant's aborted baby girl. When evil spirits created illusions, they could only draw on what they knew. The setting of a centuries-old establishment could only come from an evil spirit equally as old. Walking around the area, Shilian found no one, and he returned to the chamber where he had first lain down. It was a woman's bedchamber. Pulling out the drawers of the vanity, inside he found baby clothes and toys, such as dolls and rattling drums. Shilian studied each object, and found them to be brand new and stored with care. These items had been cherished. Meaning to this child, this woman was full of love and affection. Shilian rummaged further, and was suddenly taken aback. Within those baby clothes was a protection charm, and that protection charm was his own. Flabbergasted, Shilian had to verify it thrice. It wasn't a mistake. It was absolutely his protection charm. And it wasn't one of the simple charms he'd crafted recently, the ones for which he went into the mountains to pick herbs, sewed by hand, drew by hand, and tied with a red thread. This was the protection charm that almost everyone in the kingdom of Shenle had owned 800 years ago, during the peak of prominence of the crown prince of Shenle. The material and design were intricately exquisite, and it was stamped with the details of its provenance, and whether it had been blessed. Could the lady of this establishment have once been one of his believers? In that dead silence, Shilian suddenly heard the sound of giggling. It was clearly the laughter of a baby. It came abruptly and echoed everywhere in the room, which obscured its source. Shilian didn't move or react, but his mind churned. That laughter sounds familiar. Where have I heard it before? Where? Then it hit him. A memory of a child's voice surfaced. New bride, new bride, new bride in the red bridal sedan. Brimming tears past the hills, smile not under the bridal veil. It was the voice of that child spirit he'd heard at Mount Yujin when he was in the marriage sedan. When Shilian snapped out of it, the laughter also came to an abrupt stop. He turned around swiftly but saw no trace of the singer. After the affair on Mount Yujin, he'd asked after the child spirit in the spiritual communication array, but everyone told him there was neither child spirit nor anything of the sort to be found on that mountain, and only he had heard the voice. This was the second time this child spirit had appeared before him. So was it a coincidence? Or was it deliberate? The child spirit stopped laughing and called out, "Mom!" That call came from nearby, but Shilian couldn't figure out where. He stood there, unspeaking, holding his breath, his ears intent. After some silence, the child called out again, "Mom, hug me!" This time, Shilian figured it out. That voice came from his belly. Shilian had been holding the fake belly with both hands, and only now did he realize with astonishment that the pillow in his hands had grown heavier. He smacked it soundly, and a lump of something tumbled out of his clothes. It seemed to be a ghastly pale child, and it spewed some substance from its mouth before scrambling away into the darkness and disappearing. Shilian rushed over to inspect what it had left. The things it spat out were some clumps of thread and locks of black hair. It seemed Julian's illusion spell had worked. The little ghost had wanted to devour Julian's child, the way it did that pregnant woman's, but instead it consumed the cotton stuffed into Julian's robes. Soon after, Julian heard it cry sharply once more, "Mom!" No matter how it called, how poignantly it cried, Julian never opened his mouth. He had determined that the child spirit was in fact the spirit of a fetus, and this chamber was the room where it or its mother had once lived. Evil spirits took the form and age of what they had been upon their death. Yet it had mostly appeared as a cloud of black smoke, or a blurry white shadow. This meant the spirit itself didn't know what it should look like, so it had no proper form. The baby clothes in those drawers clearly hadn't been worn, and that terrifyingly large pool of blood on the bed brought Julian to conclude that the lady of this chamber had miscarried. Even so, her unborn child already had shape and retained a bit of consciousness. On becoming a fetus spirit, it wanted to return to its mother's belly, and so it had sought out the wealthy merchant's wife. When it called to that woman in her dream, it had been the wrong move for her to open her mouth to acknowledge it. It must be said that the bond between mother and child is special, and therefore acknowledging the title was a form of permission. When she opened her mouth, she gave the evil thing a chance to enter. The little ghost dove in, slid into her belly, and devoured the original fetus like a cuckoo in a nest. Julien was a man, but he wasn't sure whether the child spirit would take the chance to sneak into his belly if he opened his mouth. Just in case, he thought it best to keep his lips shut. Keeping them tightly sealed and gripping Fengshen in hand, Julien searched for traces of the child. He had always possessed an exceedingly sharp instinct for danger, something that had been refined through thousands of battles. Even without a clear line of sight, as long as he had a hunch, he could thrust his sword and hit the mark 9 times out of 10. Julien's strikes were weakened in the child spirit's illusion, but after multiple hits, the spirit seemed less inclined to those bouts of laughter. After doing this for a while, Julien felt a sudden pain spike in the bottom of his foot, and he paused briefly. It seemed he had stepped on something extremely sharp. The child spirit saw him fall for its trap, and cackled slyly. Though the voice was tender, it was a sound that couldn't have come from a small child, but rather a malicious grown man. It made for a sharp, distinct contrast, and quite a creepy one indeed. However, Julien's face never even twitched, and he didn't slow his pursuit. With a flick of his hand, he struck out his sword again, and the blade pierced its target once more. It had played with fire and was burned. The child spirit yelped in pain and hid far, far away. Only then did Julien take a glance under his boot. It turned out he had stepped on a small, thin needle planted into the floor, pointing straight up. It had obviously been placed by the child spirit on purpose, in the hopes that Julien would cry out in pain. However, it miscalculated. Julien was excellent at tolerating pain. Never mind stepping on a needle. If his leg were caught in a giant snare, he wouldn't understand if the situation called for him to bear it in silence. That tiny little needle was buried deep in his foot, and Julien wanted to pull it out at first, but since the child spirit scurried away after the setback, he was afraid it would take this chance to escape and continue to harm others, so he chased it out of the chamber with the needle embedded in his foot. After a while, he stopped feeling the pain and was able to run like the wind. There was no sight of the child spirit anywhere in the building, and Julien was baffled. Was it actually scared off by my attacks? Just then, without a breeze in the night air, a nearby window opened by itself. Julien immediately rushed over, but was shocked by what he saw. Outside the window, there were no signs of streets, no mountains, no pedestrians, only a deep, bottomless lake. On the other side of this lake there was a house, and in that house there sat 2 small children, Lang Ying and Guzi, eating at a table. They didn't seem to notice the thick black swirl of smoke directly above their heads, which cackled and cried out in a sharp voice, "Mom! Mom!" Julien's heart lurched. His hands gripped the windowsill, ready to warn them aloud, but then he remembered not to open his mouth and forced his voice back down. Although this was nothing more than the child spirit's illusion, he didn't know whether Lang Ying and Guzi had truly been pulled in. If they had, then any harm they suffered here would affect their real bodies. He searched for a vase or something to hurl over as a warning, but he couldn't find anything suitable. Tables and chairs wouldn't fit through the window, and on top of that, the lake separated the 2 buildings. Did this mean he had to swim over? Just then, Guzi yawned, looking listless. The cloud of black smoke suddenly gathered, ready to slip into his mouth. Children's bodies had terribly weak defenses when it came to such things. The spirit might be able to intrude even without permission. Julien had no time to think about swimming. In a split-second decision, he shouted, "Close your mouth! Run!" The moment he shouted, Lang Ying and Guzi jolted awake, closing their mouths in surprise as they leapt to their feet. The child spirit, however, had suddenly disappeared. In the next second, a cloud of black smoke exploded in Julien's face. Even though Julien closed his mouth the moment after he shouted, he could feel a stream of cold air snaking down his throat. It was the black smoke entering his stomach. His innards were numb, as if everything inside him had frozen in a matter of seconds. Julien gritted his teeth and hastily tore apart a few protection charms. He dug out the herbs and charmed papers within and stuffed them into his mouth, chewing with force and swallowing. It didn't take long before his throat itched, and the cloud of black smoke was retched back out. Julien covered his mouth with his sleeve, coughing nonstop and choked by tears. His mind ranked to find another countermeasure. Even after the cloud of black smoke was forcibly vomited out, it still swirled about and relentlessly clung to his body. Julien pushed himself onto the windowsill, raised himself up, and leapt into the lake outside. With a splash, Julien plunged deep into the heart of the lake. He held his breath, crossed his legs and arms, and assumed a meditative position, letting his body slowly sink to the bottom of that freezing lake. Once his heartbeat had returned to normal, he looked up and could somewhat make out the black fog swirling above, blocking off the surface of the water. Once he emerged, he'd have to gasp in a breath, and in doing so, he would surely suck the child spirit into his stomach. A grown man with a fulsome baby bump wasn't the least bit funny to imagine. However, his leap into the water had only been meant to give himself some time to think. It didn't take long for Julien to come up with a counterattack. So what if I swallow it? I'll just swallow Fengshen right after. He'd learned that trick when performing on the streets. Although it might hurt, whatever, as long as the child spirit could be captured. With his mind made up, Julien released his arms and started swimming upward, but the muffled sound of sloshing water came from above, and suddenly, a vast expanse of burning, vivid crimson red flooded his vision. A tangle of winding, raven-black locks obscured his sight, though nothing could be seen through the splashing water and schools of air bubbles. Julien blinked, trying desperately to bat away the thousands upon millions of lingering crystalline bubbles. Then he found himself caught by a pair of strong arms. One hand circled his waist, and the other grasped his chin. In the next second, something cool and soft covered his lips. And that is chapter 43.